Hello there, everyone. So I've been wanting to make some videos on Greek culture for a while now, and I've also wanted to make some videos on how the Western mind treats the concept of irrationality. And this gave me a perfect opportunity to combine these two subjects, bolstered by the fact that I've been rereading a fantastic book that speaks to both of these subjects, aptly titled The Greeks and the Irrational by Professor E.R. Dodds. So getting right into it then. When we think about ancient Greece, what are the impressions that spring to mind? We might imagine physical structures like the Parthenon, or we might consider deities and myths like Zeus and Odysseus, or the Iliad, for instance. Or we might expand these things into a wider field of reference. We might conceptualize Greece as being the birthplace of Western civilization, with all of its democracies and philosophies and styles of art and so on. Though if someone were to say the word rational to us, I think many of us would find it easy to marry this to our conception of ancient Greece as well. After all, this was the culture that gave us philosophers like Socrates and Aristotle. But does this give us license to think about ancient Greece as a rational culture? And how much of that popular conception of ancient Greece as a rational culture belonged to Greece as it was, and how much of it is a part of our own invention? And I want to start things off by talking about where this popular conception comes from and how recent developments in our own history alter our perception of other cultures, such as those belonging to the ancient Greeks. It's become rather fashionable in some circles to make the claim that our cultural perspective is dominated by the voice of white males. And what goes along with that is the implication that if we want to get to a more honest and three-dimensional perspective of humanity as a whole, then we need to incorporate other perspectives other than those of white males to complete the picture. Now, the issue with these kind of statements is they're often loaded with political agendas. However, that doesn't take away from the fact that within the claim itself, there is a strong kernel of truth to it. Most of us are persuaded to believe that we read things accurately through the prism of our senses and our personal education. But this belies the fact that our instruments are always limited, and therefore we experience only a perspective of the world that is awarded by the respective strengths and limitations of those instruments. In other words, we see our world, not the world. So when we stop to consider anything complex, such as another human culture, for instance, our mind floods with associated references and impressions that have been salvaged from our life experience. Therefore, when we consider a remote culture like Persia, we're not really receiving Persia as it truly was, but an interpretation of Persia that has been filtrated through a Western specific lens. We think that we understand the past, but we only understand a variant of the past that has been awarded by those lenses that are unique to our modern experience, and by extension, don't play as much of a factor into the lives of the Chinese or the Japanese or the peoples of South America, for instance, who have their own unique set of lenses through which they can interpret themselves and human history. Now, this doesn't imply that anyone's interpretation of history is totally absent of any truth to it. The point that I'm driving at is that we sometimes have to release ourselves from our attachment to entrenched interpretations if we're going to access new perspectives on what other people and other human cultures might have been like. This is a problem for academics as much as it is a problem for laymen. Culture modulates information, and quite often we translate our attachment to cultural interpretations as a confident sign that we've grasped a subject, when in reality, we're simply parroting what our culture has passed down to us. So with all that being said, how does this affect our perception of ancient Greece? Well, little do many people realize that when we think about ancient Greece, some of the popular impressions that we call upon to interpret it have only been existent in the past few hundred years. One of the most popular impressions is this image of Greece being the birthplace of high civilization and of rational thinking. But the birthplace of this interpretation arrived at a time that we call the Enlightenment. This period saw a restructuring of the power and information hierarchies, and with that came a new breed of cultural narratives that have influenced the way that we interpret various aspects of the human world, especially history and religion. Most famously is the now thankfully discredited narrative of the so-called Dark Ages, where it goes that with the onset of Christianity, the West went through a period of stagnated growth during the Middle Ages. And the reason for this stagnation was because religion was holding back innovation and progress in favour of religious dogma. And it wasn't until the Enlightenment when things actually started to pick up again. Now, of course, the reality of this is a lot more nuanced, and thankfully parts of academia have been able to re-clarify the events and frame them in a much more sophisticated image. But despite these academic developments, many people still hold on to this view of the Middle Ages because the academic development hasn't updated the cultural narrative that many people still hold on to. And so you might be asking, why are we talking about the Middle Ages? How does this tie into ancient Greece particularly? Well, the thing we have to understand is that this narrative of history is based upon certain elements of truth, and the rest is outright Enlightenment propaganda designed to discredit the power structures of the day and cement a revolutionary fervour to change the order of society. And as part of this, the Enlightenment philosophers turned to Greece as a symbol of a forward-thinking, rational civilization, in contrast to the Middle Ages, which represented its antithesis as a period of stagnation and superstition. And so essentially, the entire Middle Ages and the entire Greek classical period became condensed into a propaganda narrative to complement the revolutionary airs that were going on in Europe at the time. And ever since then, that image of Greece as this ultra-rational, progressive society has stuck with us. We could say that ancient Greece has become a cultural archetype for how modernity interprets itself. So we have to open ourselves to the fact that when we are considering these periods of history, we are largely dealing with cultural narratives that, while speaking to certain essentials, also leave out large amounts of information that would award us with a more sophisticated impression of these periods and cultures. And so in the case of the ancient Greeks, it's not like that they didn't contribute significantly to the development of Western thought, including rational systems. The problem arises when we selectively sample certain aspects of that history and construe it into a low-resolution narrative that obfuscates the wider picture. It's like cherry-picking a standout feature of contemporary American culture like the Super Bowl, and then using that to create a narrative that characterizes the entire historical development of that country and its contribution to world affairs. Human beings, like the cultures that they create, are always more complex than the narratives that surround them. And I want this video to be seen as an attempt not only to try and salvage a clearer impression of classical culture, granted in a very niche area of it. I also have another more pertinent task, which is I want to restore a much needed dose of integrity back to the concept of the irrational itself. Because the ancient Greeks were intrigued by many aspects of the irrational in life, and they dedicated great time and effort trying to come to terms with it. So if we're going to be inspired by them at all, then I suggest that we follow by their example and not fall under the spell of these modern narratives. Irrationality, like certain areas of our history, has been the subject of an unfair denigration, and the source of this denigration stems from the same types of people, who have not so much enlightened us as they've blinded us to many significant aspects of our world. And since then, many philosophers and psychologists and even artists have been embroiled in an effort to reclaim those mistreated subjects and put them over in a more reasonable light. And that's precisely what I want to try and accomplish with these videos. The first point of interest that I want to cover is a topic that we brought up in the last archetype video on the animus, that being the ambiguity surrounding human autonomy. Like popular narratives of history, it's far easier and more reassuring to go with the line that we are always in control of ourselves from the moment that we wake up to the moment that we go to sleep, and that the thoughts that enter into consciousness are always under our command. But if we look deeper into this, we find that the reality is much more complicated. It's not so much that we are in control of our behavior, rather that our behavior oscillates between self-aware critical process and passive response, where we have stimuli and impressions entering into consciousness, and we react often without much in the way of critical self-reflection being involved at all. And this essential reality of our condition cancels out the many flattering crowns that we like to ceremonially anoint ourselves with, such as the notion of man as the rational animal, because these titles encourage us to consider the human as merely the parts which complement our individualistic sense of autonomy. The deeper reality is that the human is part conscious creature and part automaton. The ancient Greeks were very sensitive to this, and they had a very interesting way of conceptualizing these things. They understood that man only has some modicum of self-control, and that at other times he is temporarily overcome to think and act in ways that defy his sense of individual autonomy. Like many ancient peoples, the Greeks translated psychic experiences through the picture language of symbolism, which granted their minds with some means of reconciling their consequences. When a person was inspired by a flash of genius, it was not the individual that made the inspired thought, but a great god like Zeus, who implanted the notion inside them for mysterious reasons. Only mundane thoughts were the province of mortal minds, but anything that stood out from the humdrum as special or peculiar was interpreted as deriving from a province beyond the ranges of conscious activity, and therefore did not belong to the individual's familiar sense of identity. These days we now have a secular terminology which has replaced the religious terminology of old. What was once a hapless instrument of the gods is now a medical patient, charged with a Latinized diagnostic criteria for interpreting various pathologies such as neuroses, paranoia, or schizophrenia. But despite the shift in reference, the ambiguity surrounding our existential states remains. Are we any more or less well off for transitioning into a secular framework? Is the human of today less provoked by spontaneous eruptions which take command of his behavior and undermine his selfhood? Let's hear what some of the ancients themselves had to say on this matter. Simonides of Amorgos was a Greek poet during the 7th century, and he had this to say on the subject of man's true power and place in the world. And whilst you're listening to these quotes, really try to consider how this contrasts against the image of the Greeks as the products of a rationalistic culture. Zeus controls the firmament of all that is and disposes as he will. But insight does not belong to man. We live like beasts, always at the mercy of what the day may bring, knowing nothing of the outcome that God will impose upon our acts. Here we see a rejection of those elements conducive to a rational dispensation, replaced by a startling ambiguity concerning mankind's ability to glean understanding about the deeper mysteries of nature and of the long-term consequences of personal acts. Through a reading of ancient accounts, what emerges is a more fatalistic image of man's place in the world, as opposed to the enlightened innovators as presented by modern interpreters. Sentiments of individual sovereignty and the ability to forge one's own future in the image of our personal desires is central to the individualistic consciousness that modernity has created. Rarely in the Greek picture do we find such cause for optimism, however. Instead, we discover a disconcerting skepticism over the ability of man to guide his life by his own hand. Another Greek poet, Theognis, writes, "No man is responsible for his own ruin or his own success. Of both these things the gods are the givers. Humanity, in utter blindness, follows its futile usages, but the gods bring all to the fulfillment that they have planned." I now want to turn to one of the most, if not the most famous of Greek sagas, the Iliad. And I want to sample from this text and from Professor Dodd's book as well, and see if this brings over a clearer image of how the ancient Greeks considered their self-autonomy through their cultural language. Now, one might counter that a work of fiction is not a good resource from which to derive conclusions about real people, but on the contrary, these historical works are remarkable in that they encode so many aspects of a people's culture, from their philosophy to their religion, to their customs and their folk psychology as well. So we can turn to such texts for an indication of how people thought about life in the same way that we might regard a film from the 1930s and see various aspects of their behavior, their style, etiquette, and language that is different from our own. And in the Iliad, we see several examples of this type of language, like, for instance, when King Agamemnon is addressing Achilles after taking a slave girl that was previously under his possession. Against accusations of deception, Agamemnon replies, "Not I was the cause of this act, but Zeus and my portion, and the Erinyes who walks in darkness. They it was who in the assembly put wild arte in my understanding on that day when I arbitrarily took Achilles' prize from him. So what could I do? Deity will always have its way." Again, don't be too quick to rush to rationalizations that this was just the king covering up for himself or simply a use of poetic language, because early Greek justice didn't care about the intent of a crime. It was only the act that mattered. Therefore, it wouldn't have made a difference whether he committed the act consciously or through persuasion by deity. The result would be the same. This is also complemented by the fact that Achilles actually agrees with Agamemnon's account when he states, "Father Zeus, great indeed are the Attai thou givest to men. Else the son of Atreus would never have persisted in raising the thumos in my chest, nor obstinately taken the girl against my will. Let the son of Atreus go to his doom, and do not disturb me, for Zeus the counsellor took away his understanding." And what's remarkable about this is that Achilles also reflects the same cultural interpretation of human autonomy when he confesses that he is also the slave of such forces. Just as Zeus forced the hand of Agamemnon to take his concubine, so in the same chain of events, Agamemnon stirs up the emotion in Achilles by invoking the rise of Thumos in his chest. In both instances, Achilles rejects the ability of men to govern their own lives and instead paints them as prey to unseen forces that take command of their ego consciousness. Reality is a conspiracy, and humans are the pawns in its game. Now, it's very easy for the modern mind to find quick explanations to dismiss the supernatural aspect within such text. But those who possess a capacity for a closer reading will recognize patterns that are intimately familiar to anyone who has ever experienced, say, a sudden realization that brought a long-standing problem to a solution, or perhaps we've been in the presence of someone who was in the thrall of their passions and had to be guided back like a lost lamb back into the paddocks of habitual consciousness. We frame these things differently, of course, but this doesn't remove from the fact that the essential patterns being addressed in Agamemnon and Achilles are still there in us. We are looking at natural psychological phenomena that are being communicated in a mytho-religious flesh. The question is whether these patterns were more hyperactive in the ancients as opposed to modern humans, and that's a concern that I'll save for my series on bicameralism. But I wanted to demonstrate this so that we could see that when we hear about these kind of things, we don't just jump the gun to rationalize them away, because often buried in these types of religious and mythological language are the very essential insights into the nature of our own human condition. Also, to make these quotations a bit easier for the modern mind to understand while still complementing our central analysis, I think it's worth addressing some of the terms that were used here. Things like Erinis, Arte, and Thumos. So we heard Agamemnon suggesting that Arte was implanted in him by the Erinis who walk in darkness. The Erinis are deities of retribution who appear to antagonize people who have committed some wrongdoing against the natural order. And they walk in darkness because they are chthonic beings, the product of a union between the similarly primordial life of the night and the earth. So they are conceptualized in the Greek mind as an external agency that can directly influence the lives of men under certain conditions. In psychological terms, the night is the unconscious, and the Erinis represent autonomous patterns that emerge from the veil of night to overcome ego consciousness. We have to be very careful, though, with the term Arte, because this can either mean something similar to the Erinis in the shape of a deity that comes to men and brings discord. Though in this case, I think that we're dealing with the more action-orientated use of the term. In this sense, arte can mean any action performed by an individual in the name of hubris. And this hubris eventually brings about their own downfall in some way. Greek drama is full of this kind of stuff about hubris that we might have to dedicate a video specifically on that subject. And I also think this is probably why Achilles was so tolerant of Agamemnon's reply when he said, "Let the son of Atreus go to his doom," because in the cultural frame of reference that Achilles was using, Agamemnon was already screwed. It was just a matter of time for it to happen. So from what we've just stated, arte is a state of mind. It points to a temporary clouding of one's consciousness, where we do not act and behave considerately or rationally. And this was communicated in a symbolic style of language that reconciled these things to the ancient Greek consciousness. Thumos is another interesting concept. Thumos is actually united closely to the concept of the anima in analytical psychology because the Greeks ascribed it to the life force stemming from the breath and the blood. So a person's thumos is basically another way of saying their spirit, something which can energize a person to act. Now, in Homer's Iliad, the term is even more specific. It pertains to the energy and intensity of one's emotions and desires. So when Agamemnon, or Zeus, depending on which way you look at it, raises the thumos in the chest of Achilles, he is galvanized by the intensity of his desire to seek retribution for the crime that has been committed. If we think back to a time in our lives when we've been waiting for someone important to call us on the phone, and we've been waiting there with all of those butterflies in our stomach, and then when we hear the telephone ring and we startle up full of energy and excitement because we know it's probably that person, that is like the god raising the thumos inside of us, and for a short time we're propelled by that feeling which affects the way that we respond to things. And these responses that we've gone over in this video have nothing whatsoever to do with being rational or being in a self-critical state. We are in a completely different mode of mind, and all of our lives we're going to be traveling through these different mind states, just as the ancients did. So the conclusion that I want to draw from this first segment is human beings are always more complicated than the cultural lenses that we interpret them through, and that most of our life we are going to be oscillating through states that have very little to do with being rational and self-aware. I focused on some in this video that imply a loss of self-agency, and this will likely have negative connotations, but as I will expand on in subsequent videos as part of my reassessment of the irrational, not all of these connotations are negative. In fact, when we actually consider them for what they are, we wouldn't want to live life without them. And so in the next video, I want to unpack other aspects of Greek culture more closely, such as their consideration towards alcohol and madness, which should be an interesting and quite funny thing to talk about. So, but for now, I'm going to leave it at that. This is the first segment on the Greeks and the irrational. If you've been impressed by this video and would like to read more about it, I highly recommend this book by Professor E.R. Dodds called The Greeks and the Irrational. It's a fantastic book. But for now, I'm just going to say thank you very much for watching. And as usual, I'll see you again.